What happens after birth is this infant goes through an incredible explosion of learning, of becoming conscious, of learning how to control the body and learning how to make sense out of all the sensual data that's flowing in from all five senses, including the kinesthetic sense of somatic body feeling. This is an explosion of learning that happens at an incredible rate. And then about 6 months, between 6 months and maybe 18 months, something else begins to emerge. And it's a sense of exploration and wonder. And the delight of learning something new begins to sparkle in the infant's eyes. And if that delight is reflected back to them by their caregiver, then the learning continues to accelerate. If it's not reflected back, then the light grows dim and it begins to decelerate. The learning slows. So these are some of the fundamental characteristics of attachment theory as it's begin to be explained right now. So, in this same period, as the emotions begin to form, and we begin to move into the next stage of development, where a first person perspective, a single person perspective begins to emerge. This happens at the same time that language begins to emerge. The child learns to speak, and the personality begins to form and take root. So between a year and around 18 months, the language begins to accumulate, accelerate the learning acquisition of language, and at the same time, the personality begins to take root and to grow. And we notice that certain things begin to emerge, like no. Sudden boundaries are set, and a sense of stubborn possessiveness, mine. And the child really sees the world as revolving completely around them, around themselves. And somewhere around the age of 5 or 6, the next stage of development begins to emerge. And what emerges with it is a second person perspective. So now the child is not only able to take their own first person perspective, but they're able to see that there's somebody else that also has a perspective. And they're able to reflect not only their perspective, but a second person perspective. This is a huge development in human growth, in human evolution. This makes it possible for the child to now be taught the rules, the cultural rules of the ethnocentric group that they were born into. Their parents then take on the task of teaching the child the rules of the world in which they live. Now, they don't realize that the child lives in a very different world than the parents live in. And that's often, especially in today's complicated cultures, the source of great conflict that begins right about this stage of development. But let's avoid that for a moment and just say that the child goes about learning what the rules are, what the ethnocentric rules are. If they're born in a religious culture, they learn the religious rules. If they're born in a scientific culture, they learn the rules of materialistic science. If they're born into a postmodern culture, they're going to learn the rules of equality and being nice and avoiding conflicts, anger. So whatever rules their parents live by, their parents are going to pass these rules on to the child at this tender age of 5 or 6. And that's going to continue till about puberty. Now, what emerges at puberty is a third-person perspective. All of a sudden, rational thought begins to emerge in the development of the child. A third-person perspective. They begin to not only take the second person perspective, but they begin to be able to see things as objects. And this is where, in a collective sense, in a cultural sense, this would be equivalent to the emergence of the scientific method and the vast explosion of knowledge that came with it. In the individual, they begin to think for themselves. They have the capacity now to decide rationally what they want to believe and what values they want to hold. And this often can be a source of conflict between the child who's just beginning to move into adulthood and the parents, if they have different sets of rational views about what the rules are. It can be a great source of conflict, which will propel the child to leave the nest in some way or just argue. So if development continues around 18 years old, when the individual goes off to college, we enter a fourth person perspective. Now they develop the capacity to see the actual cultural context in which the rules exist and to compare it to other cultural contexts. In the collective, this would be the emergence of systems theory. Now we're not only able to take a first-person perspective and a second-person perspective, see what someone else thinks and feels, and the third-person perspective, see how the objects relate to what we think and feel, but now take a fourth-person perspective, which enables us to look at these different cultural belief systems and value systems and compare them in a way that makes sense. So this is the way the individual begins to evolve and develop within the context of whatever cultures or subcultures they're exposed to. You can imagine the confusion of a child whose mother is very religious and father is scientific. They've got to navigate two completely different belief systems, which are often in conflict and the source of great arguments between their parents. The child is stuck between these two different ways of looking at the world, ways of believing what's true, and value systems. This is where it gets so interesting and complicated. I remember when I grew up, my mother was Catholic. My father was agnostic at best, if not atheist. And at a young age, when I was being indoctrinated in the Catholic school and then went to the public school, there was a huge difference in the cultural conditions in which I had to operate. This was very confusing to me, and it was very liberating when I moved from the religious constraints to the rational constraints. It was like I had a whole lot more freedom to think for myself and learn. So these things, the individual development within the context of the cultural settings and the subcultural settings becomes really important to consider. And especially when we're trying to understand these irresolvable conflicts that are showing up globally in culture wars. My favorite quote in graduate school, I was in graduate school in the 1980s. I was in a distributive social science program where theoretically I was free to roam throughout the social sciences, studying economics, anthropology, archaeology, social sciences like sociology, and political science, as well as psychology. It was a great, noble endeavor, but I found that it was not practical because all of these professors had their own prejudices. And if we move into collective shadows, the very definition of a collective shadow is a prejudice. If you want to know what your collective shadows are, really get seriously curious about what your unseen prejudices are. And because they're unseen, they're your blind spots. And you'll probably have to find someone who has very different collective beliefs and values to help you see what those blind spots are. This is very important.